The first thing I should say is just sort of frame what I'm going to talk about. I'm not an expert on martial arts. You can probably tell that, I'm not a practitioner, although Sammo Hung is one of my idols. But the purpose really of my talk is to talk about how cinema transforms martial arts, how film, the medium of film, and directors' shrewd uses of it have actually extended and enhanced what we think of as martial artistry in Asian cinema, and specifically, of course, Chinese cinema, and even more specifically, Hong Kong cinema, which is my topic for today. So let me start. One of my contentions, one of the things I'm going to try to convince you of, is that we can think about what's going on in Hong Kong martial arts cinema in a wide and comparative historical perspective. If we think about the way people normally write film history, apart from writing about directors and genres, they tend to talk about national cinemas and national schools within those national cinemas, trends that sort of coalesce at certain points in time. So for instance, the dominant trend, I think you'd have to say about American cinema, which starts really back in the 1910s, is a style of very efficient storytelling based on certain chosen techniques, like for instance, continuity editing, which is not wholly discovered by the Americans, but certainly most extensively exploited by the Americans in the 1910s, and which continues to be used as a kind of lingua franca of world cinema at the moment. So we have that kind of school, a very large-scale school. But we also have, more narrowly, something like German Expressionist cinema, the 19-teens and 20s, where German Expressionist painting and theater helped create a climate in which filmmakers come to think about another way to tell stories in film, another kind of story to tell. Same thing happens in the Soviet Union with the rise of young filmmakers at the end of the teens and beginning of the 20s who start to explore still other resources of cinema, and it creates a national school, something like what's usually called Soviet montage cinema. And then another famous example in the sound era is Italian Neorealism, of course, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, as with these others. So my claim is this, and it's not one that's widely embraced by film historians, that actually we can think of the Asian martial arts cinema as something like, let's go to the next one, something like a school. A regional school, perhaps, rather than a purely national one, but one which has its own contribution to make to what used to be called the evolution of film language, or the development of cinema as an art form. So, for instance, here, I would pick out, at least, Japan as a pioneer in this area, creating a kind of national tradition of martial arts cinema, in that case swordplay films, but also judo films like Kurosawa's Sugata Sanshiro, and Hong Kong cinema and Taiwanese cinema of the 1960s and since. That these seem to me good candidates for something like what traditional film historians have talked about as national schools. Specifically, I think, Hong Kong martial arts cinema has a very pervasive influence on world filmmaking from the 1960s on, particularly under that rubric we now call action cinema. So if you think about something like 14 Amazons from the 1970s, it looks very similar to what we would see today, and that is continued in gunplay films, things like we would again find in American cinema pretty extensively. So my argument would be that Hong Kong filmmakers spontaneously discovered appeals, patterns of engagement for audiences that Western filmmakers had tried and I don't think had mastered so well, had sought to achieve, but had not fully achieved. At least that's the claim I'm going to try to persuade you of. So now I provide a rough chronology. I know most of you know this, but I think I should just mention it. We can talk about the 1970s traditions in Hong Kong cinema of swordplay and kung fu, and the 1980s, the so-called New Wave, which really splits into 2 or 3 different strands, one of which is really for European festival cinema, art cinema. Bart Testa will be talking about an example of that tomorrow night with Boat People, but also a more commercial, more industry-oriented trend, which we find in the works of people like Choi Hak, Jackie Chan, who's also going to be here tomorrow. And by the 80s, you have what you might call the industry generation taking over, that those people become exemplary of the new and vibrant Hong Kong martial arts, or broadly speaking, action cinema. And then as the West starts to notice those trends, they bring some of those filmmakers over, like as John Woo was brought over for Van Damme films. But why? So what attracts Western audiences to this broad regional/national school? I have a couple of hypotheses. One is, of course, violence, never hurts. And because of the censorship strictures in Hong Kong, things could be much more over the top than they could be in most Western cinemas. So for instance, when you want to show blood brotherhood, why not just have blood glue these guys together? That's one way to give it, a very visceral way. And of course, the outstanding stunts, things that no American would try, but in the days before CGI and wire work. And of course, immensely attractive stars, many of whom have migrated into Western cinema. And then what I call the jaw drop factor, the thing that just leaves you gaping. Like, new one-armed swordsman, how many one-armed swordsmen can you count in this picture? And how many arms, actually, can you count in this picture? So those are pretty obvious appeals. There's no doubt that for the fanboys and fangirls of the 70s and 80s and thereafter, these are pretty strong, and they offer a kind of other cinema, an alternative, a kind of dream cinema that's different from what you get with most commercial fare in the West. I think there's another factor that drove people to Hong Kong martial arts cinema. And that has to do with more technical things, which I'm going to try to share with you tonight. The handling of film style. Because my claim is that Hong Kong cinema innovates new ways of staging physical action in film. A more dynamic and engaging approach to physical action. And in a weird way, Western filmmakers had been dreaming of this. They had been long thinking, many of them, had been thinking, how can we get the audience viscerally aroused? How can we really get them wrapped up in and transported by what they see and hear? Seizing the spectator, you might say. As I say, this was kind of dream of a thoroughly kinetic cinema, not just through what is shown, but through how it's shown. And how, of course, we respond to that. So when a film like King Hu's Touch of Zen becomes available to the West, like say at the Cannes Film Festival, people say, you know, we haven't seen anything like this. And I go back to what Yuen Wo-ping once said to me in an interview. I said, what are you aiming at? What are you trying to do? He says, I want to make the viewer feel the blow. And tonight I'm going to show you some things I think that exemplify that idea that somehow, through cinema, you can transmit the kinetic energy and impact of physical contact with the world, particularly fighting, combat. You can transmit that to the spectator, so you do feel the blow. And another critic has put it, Barbara Sharas at the Chicago Film Center says, you come out of one of those movies thinking you can do anything. Now, as I say, this isn't completely unique to Hong Kong, and certainly we see filmmakers striving for this. I think if you go back to American silent comedy, you see something like this in the thrill comedy, say, of Doug Fairbanks or Harold Lloyd. And certainly you see something like it in the films of Japan, Kurosawa, and others who develop the jidaigeki in ways that do convey some of this. But I think the Hong Kong filmmakers took it further. Same thing with the Russians. I think that they dreamed of a kind of kinetic cinema as well. We tend to forget that Soviet montage cinema, which is sometimes portrayed as a cinema of ideas, it's going to educate the spectator, it's going to inculcate Leninist ideology into the spectator as a rather abstract and conceptual sort of filmmaking. Well, it had that side. But most of those filmmakers were also extremely interested in visceral arousal. They wanted to get people galvanized by what they saw. So, for instance, in Storm Over Asia, there's a fantastic action sequence at the end of that film by Pudovkin. There's a wonderful scene in By the Law, the Kuleshov film, where there's a fight over a shotgun in a cabin. And what happens is that in the course of it, this man whom you can see, my shot, he's been shot already, and he's tipped forward into his plate. And Kuleshov then cuts into him, and the beans in his plate start dribbling down his face, almost as if they were his brains. And then, of course, very famously, Eisenstein, who was, we'll come back to him at a couple points in the course of tonight, very interested in physical impact on the spectator, the so-called montage of attractions that make you feel a visceral response. So there's a way in which the Soviets thought particularly about this kind of physical arousal of the spectator. And I go back to Eisenstein because he, in both the way he wrote about cinema and the way he made films was trying to do that with the resources available at his disposal. So a famous sequence in Potemkin, I think many of you have seen, is when a sailor smashes a plate in indignation at what's written on the plate. And what Eisenstein does is he cuts it up in a very unorthodox way. It's sort of a forearm smash in the beginning of it, and he starts to bring it down at the end of that shot, and then we get a sudden close-up of the sailor, and then suddenly he's smashing it another way. It's a contradictory gesture. Can't have it both ways, but Eisenstein does because it's cinema, and winds up smashing the plate in a completely opposite way. So the effect when you see it is this kind of crisscross effect. It's as if he's grown another arm. Eisenstein was fascinated, by the way in which the discus thrower, that classic sculpture, really represents an impossible position. Or the way in which figures in caricatures like Daumier's, if you break them down into different pieces, they couldn't really walk that way and swing their arms that way. So there's a way in which Eisenstein saw the potential of cinema to sort of disassemble the human body and create fragments that have more impact than if they had just been simply photographed straightforwardly. And he believed that if you did it right, if you framed, staged, cut those movements right, there would be what he called an infection of the spectator, that the spectator would feel that movement more dynamically than if it had been straightforwardly recorded without any cutting. If you set it up right, there would be this kind of benevolent contagion of the movement itself pumping you up. And he tried for that in several of his films. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Eisenstein was very interested in Chinese culture. And he saw in both Japanese and Chinese theater something akin to what he was interested in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese connection tonight. Because in a way, what he called expressive movement, which is what he's aiming for, is cinematically endowed expressive movement, is really built into many Chinese traditions. Of course, for theater, there's a performance discipline, plus the patterning of the movement, creating a very elaborate choreography, like in Peking, Beijing opera. And something I'll be dwelling a lot on tonight is the rhythmic nature of that patterning, that there's a very strong, what I'll be calling a pause, burst, pause organization of movement. Rather than a single fluid movement like that, you get that. And of course, if you think about it, that's sort of cinematic in itself. And the argument would be that cinema can not only display these dynamic features, it can capture the rhythm of a combat executed in one of the schools of martial arts, but it can also enhance it. It can build it up, amplify it, intensify it. So I'm going to show you several examples in the course of tonight, starting with some simple ones and ending with a very complex one, of how this might go in terms of cinematic technique. My first example is from Bruce Lee's Way of the Dragon. It's a very straightforward scene, but I think you can notice right away how Bruce Lee uses this pause, burst, pause pattern in a very clear, almost diagrammatic fashion. You can just sort of spells it out for us, because it's a very simple encounter, but still rather, pretty kinetic. That's the ticket. He was going to leave Rome. That's the ticket, his air ticket. But instead, he jerks it up, flashes it down, meaning I'm staying, I'm going to defend this restaurant. Well, if you put this film on a film copy of this film, not a DVD, on a flatbed editor, you can see that this has got an amazing metronomic quality. That you can see that it breaks down very neatly into discrete phases. 12 frames when he knocks a knife out of the guy's hand, 16 frames when he thrusts the guy's gut, 45, and this is the great where he uses the pole to just push the guy down, like flattening him like a comma, and then 10 frames where we just sit there. And then, which is so fabulous, that gesture, it's the same kind of rhythm, the same staccato rhythm that he used to defeat the guy to do this bit of acting. It could have been like that, but instead it's like that, telegraphed. And so what happens is that even though this is a single shot, there's no cutting, there's almost nothing but Bruce Lee's performance rhythm. But even within that, you can get that shaping that I've been describing, this rhythmic accentuation through just the pause, burst, pause pattern. Now, this is without editing, as I said. So what happens when you have editing to add to the mix? Well, we'll see several examples, but to give you a quick instance, of course, one of the things that's used in particularly the swordplay films, the wuxia films, is the Possibility of using editing to create impossible feats, the flying swordsman, palm power, the kinds of things that are associated with fantasy swordplay, literature, and visual arts, comics and so on, can be done through editing. So a classic example is in Golden Swallow when our man Silver Rock jumps up. We get a shot of him jumping, a shot of the reaction, a shot of him flying through the air, coming down behind his adversary, and then landing, and this to me is the real Hong Kong touch, as he rises, his adversary sinks down. Again, this little rhythmic riff right there. But also, because editing has created that stunt. Clearly, he has jumped in one shot, he has flown through the air in another shot, probably launched by a trampoline or something like that, and then he lands in another shot. So we can cut up the performance and make him do something quite extraordinary. But also you get an enhancement of the expressive quality through editing too. You can accent or oomph the visuals. And you'll see many examples. But here when Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon is fighting off the doctor, I forget his name suddenly. He's Han, yeah. You have a shot right in close on Bruce, and then as he raises his leg to swipe the guy's head off, you cut right back. It's a very, very percussive kind of cut. It's an axial cut right along the lens axis of the camera. And it also allows him to put a dummy in and really let that head fly off. So the editing can add to the percussive quality through these phasing of the action, of putting in a cut at a certain moment. But it can also create the scene's dynamism too. And this is what I want to show you in my next clip. This is from John Woo's Hard Boiled. I'm sure you've seen this many times. But what I'm so fascinated by in this is the way in which cuts are spread out. Sometimes they keep the movement flowing. It's part of the burst phase. At another moment, the cut accentuates the pause phase. So you can have a string of shots that flow very nicely because of the momentum of the action that's respected. And then you can also have a cut that brings it all to a kind of sharp conclusion. And this is what I hope to show you first. And you can see it, we lay it out again, it's very advantageous to look at on a flatbed. But he starts with the reverse shot of the bad guy firing, and then we get a flow of cuts. We get Chow rolling across the table in this flower. He continues to roll, that's the same shot panned over a little bit. And then a very high angle that maintains the momentum of that movement. It's a match on action. And then that movement is still matched when he comes like zipping into the frame, okay, like a ghost. And then freezes. That's the pause. And that's when he cuts into the closer views of the other guys. So the editing can stretch out and prolong the burst and then accentuate the pause. There are lots of other techniques that can be done in cooperation with this. I'm going to show you a couple now. One is the much maligned zoom. I'm actually a fan of zooms, at least in Hong Kong films, but you know, they've got to be feeling kind of cheesy in the 1970s and 80s. They're coming back now. But for a long time, it was sort of the mark of low-level cinema to have zooms. But as you'd expect from this very rhythmically oriented cinema, there's a way in which the zoom gets pulled into that rhythm. Because not only can a cut extend the burst of action or chop it off, so can a zoom be used to accentuate the action. And we'll see that in this first clip. In the second clip, you'll see some really fine-grained detailing, some precision design, where particular shot close-ups are inserted, as almost on the beat of the martial arts encounter itself, to really make sure you understand the finest detail of the fight. In fact, Corey Yun Kwai uses this very often in his films. He builds a whole fight scene out of just hands, body parts, and so forth. So the first one is from Return to the 36th Chamber. I think, maybe that's being shown in this series, or maybe just the 36th Chamber. So what I want to argue is that both the zoom technique and this sort of fine-grained precisionist technique really do create this kind of, and sharpen the kind of rhythmic patterning that Eisenstein and others were interested in. Take the L'Arc-Lion scene with the zooms coming in with the performance. What you get there are dynamic bursts, not only of the actors, but of the actual framing as it zooms in and out, which then I think help the pause parts particularly. They come in, they will start on a detail where there's a moment of pause and then zoom back as the action expands, sort of like those explosive splash panels you might get in a comic strip or something like that. So here, for instance, where we have a long shot of the adversary's grabbing Gordon Liu's sleeve, and then we cut to the hand and then zoom back as Gordon Liu unwinds it and starts wrapping it around the opponent's wrists. That's where the zoom sort of scoops in and out of the scene, picking out the details and then inserting them into the broader context of the flow of the action. But you also get it with Yun Kuei, what I call precisionist editing, that builds the action out of these rhythmically accented details. So a cut often each shot has only one piece of information, and they're just added up very fast. This is very Eisensteinian. And then we have to keep up as the details come popping out at us. So for instance, the handcuffs, and once they get on the balcony, the handcuffs are the crux of the scene, and Cynthia Rothrock holds it up and says, this is your end. And then as the scene develops, what happens with the hands and the handcuffs become the crux or pivot of the action. And it's broken up into all these little details so that when they slide around the balcony edge, or particularly a shot I like very much, this low angle where a hand comes out, and can't really capture it very well in a frame, but you see the hand and there's the cuff. Cynthia Rothrock's got it in the hand, and then it drops right out toward the camera. You probably remember that. It just falls right onto the camera, but then Yun Bao's hand comes in and grabs it and wraps it around the stanchion of the balcony and snaps it shut. And there's another parallel scene when the other side is lashed on. So you get these kind of very fine-grained details that link together and only make sense. They make the action intelligible as the various maneuvers in the fight, but at the same time, because they're so short, so simple, and cut together in ways that make it very intelligible, they add little percussive accents, like in poetry, where a certain rhyme or beat just sort of falls into place. Okay, these are about action scenes. I've shown you several instances of action scenes that use this pause, burst, pause, the rhythm to dynamize the fight and not only make it more intelligible, but make it more kinetic. But not every scene in every movie, not even in a Hong Kong movie, is an action scene. And people aren't fighting, for the full 83 minutes. So what goes on? Well, I argue that actually this approach to rendering physical action sort of bled over into the handlings of conversation scenes. So dialogue scenes are given a kind of new extra impact by virtue of this aesthetic. So you can have silent scenes of recognition where someone actually thinks, oh, okay, I could do this, is given a sort of extra little bump or oomph by virtue of this approach. So for instance, in 14 Amazons, when a woman realizes the possibility of a battle strategy, we get a very close shot of her, and it all moves her eyes. She opens her eyes and lifts her head a little bit, and then she just dodges out of the frame in this very tight framing. And then the very next shot, she pops in and stops. She just stops dead. So you get that burst and pause rhythm in a scene of discovery. She's not fighting anyone. She's just realizing something. And that kind of little extra accent perpetuates the scenes. It keeps the scenes going. More elaborately, as I said, in conversation scenes, you can do the same kind of thing. You can carry expressive movement into these scenes. So for instance, in Yes, Madam, another Yun Kuei film, you get a kind of rocking horse rhythm as two people face each other. They don't touch, they don't fight, but the way in which they're shown talking to each other gives that sort of punchy quality. So for instance, when Mang Hoi is making an offer to the gangster boss, he leans forward. Cut to gangster boss who's already leaning forward, tipping back. He talks a little bit, and then Mang Hoi, who's leaning forward, tips back. And the gangster leans forward. This sort of seesawing quality that you get in this dialogue scene, I don't think you'd find that in a Hollywood director. They're just talking. It's just a dialogue scene. But it's a kind of a power contest. It's rendered in and through this. Now, I have a much more complicated example for you, and I don't have time to break it down, but I think you've seen it if you saw Chinese Ghost Story the other night when it was shown here, and you can easily see it because it's available on video. But this is a remarkably complex use of this putting this rhythmic template over a conversation scene, keeping the actors constantly moving, keeping the staging very dynamic, while dialogue and other things are going on, but also giving it a tremendous kinetic variety. I would also ask you to look for things that you would not see in Western cinema except probably in cartoons, so that the synchronization of sound effects with characters' movements, so-called Mickey Mousing in the West. So when Mickey's walking, it's da-dum, 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 that sort of thing. We think that that's pretty stupid. But actually, Eisenstein was fascinated by this because he thought this really engages the spectator. One of the reasons that cartoons are so effective is because it goes right for that kinetic matching of the movement of the music, the movement of the figures. And Hong Kong cinema does this too. It actually, I think, synchronizes unexpectedly aspects of noise or of music with character movement or even just the movement of eyes. You'll see some of that in this. As I say, it's pretty complicated to go through, but you get a sense, I think, that these movements are reflecting each other and compensating for each other. When the sister thrusts her hand towards the water, she's deflected by a parallel movement, and they hold it for a second, less than a second. Anyway, this gives you a hint of how almost any scene could be dynamized through this sort of breakdown approach, whereby the action either flows or halts in sort of minutely adjudged moments. Now, one director who really is quite important in this story I'm telling you is King Hu, who came from China, mainland China, wound up working in Hong Kong, transferred to Taiwan, wound up in the United States, actually. He brought to the martial arts film, I think, a pretty interesting sensibility, because he realized this percussive quality, this staccato idea of pause and burst, but he didn't try, I think, to follow the rules that were emerging in his community. He was trying different things. He's kind of experimenting. For one thing, when he cuts from one point of action to another, and here he's using the wide screen, he will cut in ways that force us to check the frame, the next shot, for where the point of interest is. In other words, he doesn't aim necessarily to continue whatever's the center of interest in one shot into that same zone of the next shot. In fact, you kind of have to hunt around in many of his combat scenes for where the person you just saw is again. It's not clumsiness, it really dynamizes the scene. So, for instance, in this, the climactic fight of the first part of Touch of Zen, we got a soaring swordswoman coming down the sky, sort of a point of view shot, but then she sails in from the top and swipes him again, so the center of interest is shifted from this part of the frame. She was in the center before, this part of the frame, and then suddenly comes swiping up quite unexpectedly from the other side. And then she finishes her movement, slicing at the guy's face, way over here, and another couple are grappling here in the foreground. So there's a momentary, shift of jolt of where am I looking? What am I supposed to see? He also cultivated jump cutting. He liked the idea that you don't have to match your shots. If you want a flow, you can actually create a flow by leaving out some frames, odd though that sounds. And I talk about this in a blog. You can read more about this particular cut on my blog that Teresa mentioned. So for instance, Han Yingji jumps up in one shot to confront Roy Chow, the monk, and one shot suddenly becomes this. I'm not leaving anything out. I'm not leaving out anything he didn't leave out, that is. There's the whole arc of the jump and everything has just been sliced out. And this is the splice. You can see the splice right there. Magical powers. And one of my contentions about King Hu is that he actually uses these film techniques to suggest, rather than show, that his warriors have these extraordinary powers. They're supernatural powers of jumping very high, moving very fast, endless resources of strength, and so forth. All these things can be suggested by a style that's a bit disjunctive, sort of the blink if you miss it approach. That is, wait, did that really happen? Rather than sort of spelling it out the way we saw with the Chang Che clip of Golden Swallow. And he also tries these, what I call rhymed cutting, that maximizes the physical force. This I think really does exemplify that Yun Wo Ping quote of, I want to make the viewer feel the blow. In the earlier part of the scene, you have a pretty conventional, constructive kind of approach to the action where the pieces are built up pretty intelligibly at various points. But you still get the accentuation so that when the boy comes up behind the tree, you just have enough time to see him pop up behind the tree before the cut comes. So the accentuation is there. But here what you get is that flow of the guy running to slam him with the feet, but then all broken up. it's never handled the same way twice. There are 10 separate assaults, and each time a piece is deleted. Maybe it's the running part, maybe it's the landing part, maybe it's the running off part, maybe it's the kick is always there, but sometimes it's shown from one side rather than the other. So you get this whole sort of matrix. It's like a theme and variations in music, where all the possible combinations of this encounter are played out, I think, 9 times. So the upshot of this is that there's this kind of incessant pounding of this, I think, affects, at least me, it affects the spectator. That would be my claim anyway. All right. There we go. Yeah, and this is an example of this. Is some of the pieces that are reassembled again and again to create this. So in a way, he's using the classic situation of the Shaw Brothers kind of martial arts. The pieces are broken down, but they're broken down in a very aggressive kind of way. Well, okay, I tried to claim that Eisenstein dreamed of expressive movement that would infect the spectator, would pass the contagion of the movement of the performer to the spectator, with cinema acting as a kind of magnifying lens of that. In fact, making possible certain effects that couldn't be executed by an actual performer. The argument would be then that this is kind of thanks to cinematic technique that this happens. It feels contagious. And I think intuitively we want to say that that's sort of certainly one possibility. The activation of our perceptual systems, and I have neglected sound, but sound is tremendously important in all the clips I've shown you, yield to this, both audio and visual, add to this kind of dynamic movement. But also it's emotional. It's not just enough to get us keyed up. There's a kind of transfer, a mysterious transfer where we feel more emotionally aroused. It might be elation in some cases. It might be the sense of aggression and defensiveness in this last example. But there's an emotional payoff or kickoff from this perceptual stirring up. We see this elsewhere in the world. We see it in the circus. And Eisenstein, of course, was very interested in the circus. We see it in professional wrestling. The spectacle of suffering, as Roland Barthes called it, where everything is exaggerated, but somehow it's more enjoyable that way. And of course, we see it in cartoons all the time. Stretch and squash in animated films is based on this kind of exaggeration given an emotional coding or coloring. Eisenstein again, and his argument was that because the stimuli become so vigorously patterned, so rigorous, the audience, I'm quoting him here, repeats in reflexively weakened form what is played out on the screen. It's sometimes fun to watch other people watch a martial arts film, especially if you have a clip tape or DVD at your house. You can watch people, reacting to what you know well. And they're like twitching. They do these kind of, and they're not as vigorous movements as the people they're seeing on the screen, but it's as if there's a kind of, like they're being played like a gong or a piano by the film, these little strokes. So the suggestion would be there is a kind of infection or some sort of passover of this rhythmically patterned movement to the spectator when it's done right. Now, I'm not going to become a great advocate of mirror neurons, but there's one current explanation for how we're able to sense this kind of quality and feel in our bodies responses to what we see that's being floated in neuropsychology is this idea of mirror neurons, that there are dedicated clusters in our cerebral cortex that actually are designed by evolution to mimic or copy what's seen, as was come to be known as monkey see, monkey do. They recognize and trigger imitation of what's seen, even if the physical action isn't there. So the argument goes by people like Vittorio Gallese, he calls it embodied simulation. You're copying it in your own body. And the classic example is the monkey who grasps a banana, that activates certain areas of the brain. And when the monkey sees someone grasping a banana, those same areas are activated. And they first discovered this actually by showing chimpanzees films, videos, which implies that they don't even have to see an actual creature in front of them doing this action, executing this action. They only need to see images of it, which of course fits into cinema studies perfectly. And we're familiar with this kind of thing. For instance, when one person yawns, it's contagious. And the emotional payoff would come with when your team makes the goal, when the bad guy is defeated, whatever, the elation is an emotional overlay, a coloring of that physical recognition in your brain. I know what it's like to execute that action. I know what it's like to chest the tape. I know what it's like to fall to the ground. And that carries an emotional punch. Now, as I say, there's a great deal of debate about mirror neurons in humans. Some people say we don't even actually have them. Some people say they can't explain everything. I'm not qualified to take that up. I just invoke this as one example of how we've come to understand the possibility that mimicry of physical action and its attendant associational coloring, emotional coloring, could be explained and would then have implications for all of cinema, not just martial arts cinema, of course. Any sort of movement that you would see on the screen. So I float this to you just as one candidate for understanding this better, and which could be studied scientifically, I think, if the people wanted to take the trouble. Now I show you my most complex example of this. It's a sequence that's become very famous, and you could spend a long time dissecting it along the dimensions I've been sketching here. But it does, I think, exemplify everything I've been talking about. The way in which camera movement, cutting, framing, shot scale, and the patterning of the movement, of course, amplified by sound effects particularly, and also, I think, flinching. This is a scene where I don't know anyone who doesn't react very viscerally to what goes on in this scene. You really feel this in your body. You can very quickly, and it doesn't seem to be an intellectual activity, you don't need much imagination to sense what this would feel like. Yes. In the trade, we call this the Odessa step sequence of Hong Kong cinema. This is truly, and you could analyze it along any of the dimensions I've mentioned. You notice the pause, burst, pause rhythm. It's especially detectable, and I should have said this at the outset, if you just listen to the soundtrack. Sometimes it's useful to just turn the picture off, and what you hear are very strongly accented drum beats in these combat sequences. I mean, they're very precisely articulated as sounds as well as images. But also, of course, here where if there are mirror neurons, they're working overtime because you understand what it's like to feel this blow or to fall this way or especially to plunge your head through glass. So those kinds of things, I think, the flinch response that we get here is kind of prima facie indication that something very deep and powerful is happening through the use of film technique. Now, Jackie Chan is an extraordinarily good director at this point in his career. So clearly, everything has been very carefully done. But nevertheless, the primal power of a sequence like this and some of the others I've shown you suggest to me that essentially what happened was that Hong Kong filmmakers discovered something about cinema. They made a very important discovery about what cinema could do. And I think because that discovery was sensed so powerfully, both in Asia and in the West, you find American cinema borrowing from Hong Kong. I mean, obviously there are certain things famously derived from Hong Kong films, but though maybe not so famously in the case of Boondock Saints, but it is a kind of a Hong Kong movie, it seems to me. And of course, Hong Kong borrowing from Hollywood as well, even doing remakes of film. Authentic remakes, authorized remakes. Do you ever think you'd see the day that a Hong Kong filmmaker would make an authorized remake of a Hollywood movie? Things have really changed. At any rate, so there's this interplay where I think people sensed, without being able fully to realize, people in the West sensed that there was something uniquely powerful about this cinematic tradition. So what I end by saying that I think that Hong Kong filmmakers, and more broadly Chinese filmmakers, and still more broadly Asian filmmakers, can be quite proud of this tradition that they forged. It hasn't achieved enough recognition, I think, in the official precincts of film historiography, people who study national cinemas and international trends. But I do think that if you just take a look at the remarkable accomplishments of this cinema over a period from the 60s to at least the 90s, you get a collection of masterpieces that are really worthy to stand with anything that we have in the history of European or American cinema. So thank you for your attention, and I appreciate your patience, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Hello? Okay, great. So please, any questions or comments? Yes, please.
mics that will come to find?
Oh yes, there are roving mics.
Thank you very much, Professor Bordwell.
My pleasure.
I'm wondering if you think there's something specific about this culture or the history of other art forms within these countries that developed the type of stylistic, or there's something specific linguistically that helped develop this type of staccato, pause, move style.
On language, I can't say. I'm no expert in that. And indeed, I'm not an expert in the theatrical or musical traditions either. But I would point out that much of Asian theater generally, and certainly Chinese theater, is a percussion-based theater. It's based on both the instruments of the accompaniment and the actual movement of the actors are trained as, quasi-gymnastic or quasi-acrobatic kinds of performances. So that kind of articulated movement where things go, you find it both in Japanese theater and in Chinese theater. Eisenstein writes about how he was fascinated to see a kabuki performance, and he said they act in slow motion but with a stutter, like a film frame. And it reminded him of film, the way in which No and kabuki performances have this kind of arrest and movement dynamic. And the same thing with Mei Lan Fang in his essay called Enchanted from the Pear Garden, where he talks about that kind of flow and yet abruptness that you can get. So by hypothesis, I say that, that of course comes out of the martial arts tradition where the sets are performed, each suite of gestures may flow together and then stop, that sort of thing. So those are the cultural circumstances I would look to as the most adjacent. But maybe we could extend it more to other things like language. I'm not the person to do that, though. Anything else? I need to be able to see you a little more clearly. Yes. No.
So how deeply can you read this pause, burst, pause? Can we go down to an auteur level, and would you say like an individual director would have their own kind of DNA, their own kind of Morse-like DNA around pause, burst, pause? So is that a way of explaining sort of the stylistic differences between like a Chang Che or King Hu?
Yes, I would say so. I think if you put them lay them out side by side, a Chang Che, a King Hu, a Lau Kar Lung, I think Yun Kuei, if you actually lay them out and compare them along these dimensions, you could find authorial signatures. I do think that. I think it's especially obvious in the case of King Hu. I mean, clearly, he is doing, and what's fascinating about that is he's taking a schema that's very common. He's using that thing that we saw in Golden Swallow of someone launches, they leap, they're in the air, and they land. But he then plays with all the possibilities of that. For instance, in the blog entry I mentioned, I cite another example where he lets someone launch, but they leave the frame, and the frame is empty. And then they come down in a most unexpected area of the frame, in a most unexpected posture. That sort of thing, he's tweaking that very basic template in different directions. And I think you find it, with Jackie, it's speed. I mean, partly what Jackie's interested in, it seems to me, is how long can he make the burst? How long can this kind of pop, 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 and then bam, like that. And that itself, I think, is a kind of accomplishment. He's also accelerating the speed of the film sometimes, too, to get that effect. With Yun Kuei, I think it's, as I said, it's much more of a detailing of the bits and pieces of the action spread out for you like a motor, like an exploded view of a machine, But I think you could find it, you could track it in different ways. And even now, I think that occasionally, one of the examples I usually use, I didn't include this time. Some of you know Johnny Doe's film, The Mission. Well, I would argue with what he does there is he said, okay, pause, 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 burst, pause, pause. It's like, you guys make action movies, I'm going to try making an inaction movie, Kitano does this too. If you know Takeshi Kitano, he does something similar to that. It's partly thematic with Kitano, like how boring it is to be a hitman. You just hang out all the time. but also these sudden flurries of violence that interrupt absolutely static scenes, almost Ozu-like in their tranquility, and then comes down again. So I think you could actually, maybe make a map of different Asian action filmmakers along that one dimension of the pause, burst, pause. There are many other things going on, like shot scale, camera movement. Some directors move the camera a lot more than others, the zoom, and all those kinds of things. But as a point of departure, you could probably make some rough approximations about those differences. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, please. Thanks. Oh, someone over here? Okay, go ahead first, yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the use of slow motion and when that started to become a thing?
Yeah.
It seems like more of a relatively modern technique.
Well, it's a good point. It starts really in the 70s. You start to get it in the 70s. And it becomes, there are different kinds of slow motion. There is slow motion that's done in the filming, because they're decelerating, or in this case, accelerating the rate of the film's passage through the camera. So it's photographic slow motion. But then also what you start to get in the 80s and 90s is post-production slow motion, where they actually are slowing it down in the printing process, essentially, in optical printing. And those have very different effects. I mean, this is one of the things I think Western cinema has picked up quite a bit. And arguably, I was once on a panel in Tokyo, and there was a quarrel about who invented slow motion action. And one of the panelists, a professor, said, "I blame Kurosawa. It's in the Seven Samurai. Kurosawa is a criminal for creating this, because now everyone has copied him. Peckinpah copied him, and all this. And in fact, the headline in the paper the next day was Professor Blank, I won't tell you who it was, calls Kurosawa a criminal. But but it does go back quite a ways, and I think it really goes back to some Asian sources, and that's copied by the West. But what you find, I think, with Hong Kong specifically, is that some use it to convey an impression of enormous strength, so that the heaviness of, say, smashing something, it gets an extra impact from that idea of like this enormous weight that's coming down on it. Other times, I think slow motion is used in a more balletic way because it simply creates an interesting pattern. And you can cut between fast or normal motion and slow motion to create that same kind of gap or abruptness that I was talking about earlier. So again, as Noah's point was, you can find different directors using it in different ways. But by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, the post-production kind became very common. If you look at, say, Wong Kar-wai's films, when he has physical action in those films, which admittedly is not always that often, but when he does, he's almost always using that post-production slurred slow motion, which fits very well into this aesthetic of the blur and the glimpse that he relies on, that you don't quite get a perfect frame sometimes. People are moving and hidden by things, or broken up, or in light and shadow, and so forth. And that kind of works for something like Ashes of Time, where the thing's been super processed. The action scenes are either very fast or hard to even make out. Even though the choreography is quite concrete, the pictorial abstraction kind of takes it away. But it's still, again, through the sound in many cases, like in Ashes of Time, it's the sound that makes the slow motion seem maybe more dynamic than it looks. But again, it's something that needs to be studied more. I don't have a very full explanation.
Thank you very much for your lecture today, or this evening.
Andrea, yes.
I'm pretty ignorant about martial arts in Hong Kong cinema, so my question may be silly, but you've talked about it within the context of directorial style and everything. And I wanted to ask the question about how much, though, did individual cinematographers or film editors themselves create, initiate, or refine these styles? Because you didn't mention these sort of individuals specifically.
It's a very, very important question. Cinematographers to some degree, but really, in many cases, the key creators are the martial arts choreographers. In fact, for some directors, they're not even, directing that much. They will turn action scenes over to the choreographer, or there'll be a close collaboration between the director and the martial arts choreographer. Someone like Yuen Woo-ping, some people who are more discerning than I am, can actually look at a film and see if Yuen Woo-ping directed the martial arts sequences. So there's definitely another authorial input there, at least with the martial arts choreographers. And I think many of these directors, of course, have been martial artists. Ching Tzu-tung and particularly Yun Kuei were themselves trained in the martial arts. Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan. So they're both kind of functioning as a overseeing choreographer and a director. But you're right, that's an important input. And I always had this fantasy. When I first started seeing these films in the 70s, sometimes quite obscure ones, like a Taiwanese film called Kung Fu Mystagogue, which I'm sure Colin has seen many times. And I would look at these sequences of incredibly fast-cutting dynamic angles, and I thought somewhere there's a Chinese editor sitting in a little room, just cutting these 4-frame shots to eternity, and so clearly there is some of that too. I completely agree. Yes, please.
So David, I'm just curious, why do you think many Hong Kong or Asian film directors have not made it as successfully in Hollywood, like Titano with Brother, and he went back afterwards, or Ringo Lam and some people like that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's a complicated question. It's a good one. Partly because, I would say, the Hong Kong aesthetic is a little too brutal for Hollywood. It's a little too raw. And even when it's kind of cerebrally retreated by someone like Tarantino, it's not really welcome. I mean, it's very funny. John Woo, I think, once said, "You hired me to do this stuff, and now you won't let me do it." You brought me in specifically because we made films this way, like Hard Boiled, and yet now I can't do it. But there is that. There's a kind of self-censorship or indeed fear of the rating system that limits some of these things. But also, I think it's partly because there's a sense in which Hong Kong cinema verges on the cartoonish. To me, that's a positive, because it's actually pushing towards something very primal, as I was trying to say. But there is an aesthetic of realism, a certain kind of realism in American cinema that says unless it's a comedy, it can't really be over the top. But in Hong Kong cinema, it can be over the top and not be a comedy. And so there's, I think, that pressure towards a kind of superficial verisimilitude or realism that makes people pull back from it. But I also think there's some other mundane factors, like learning English, knowing English well, trying to get out of certain genres. I mean, there was a time when everyone said, I have to make my Van Damme film so I can actually make a real film. And really only John Woo, I guess you could say, did that. So there's several factors, I'm sure, and industrial things I don't know about. Plus, frankly, I think there's prejudice, just flat out prejudice. I mean, the American film industry has not welcomed African-American filmmakers, Asian-American filmmakers. And notice when Justin Lim gets to make a film, what kind of film it is, So, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of factors I'm not aware of, but those would be my candidates for a start of an explanation. Yes, please.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you for guiding me through my degree. That was excellent.
The bill is yet to arrive.
My question, I guess, is in a larger sense. So we talked a lot about the actual scene construction and action construction. Do you think that breathing rhythm also has the ability or should be introduced into the narrative arc of the film? So like pause in the storyline.
Yeah. That's an interesting point too. One of the classic things that people say, and sometimes people who don't like Hong Kong films say this, is that the films don't really have good stories, or that they don't have Western conceptions of good stories. And in fact, I think Hong Kong filmmakers were quite sensitive to that, partly because I think they had cultivated a tradition of what we might call episodic construction. Episodic construction is not a big deal in American cinema. It stands for comedies, maybe, stoner comedies and stuff like that can be kind of loose, but you still have to have the three-act structure more or less there, and you need to have a character who changes, and you need to have, obstacles, and all the stuff we know about screenplay writing. It's very difficult to get away from that. I think Hong Kong cinema is closer to a much broader popular tradition around the world than American formulaic narrative cinema is. Episodic narratives are probably the dominant narratives. If you look at all narratives all over the world, that's probably what you'll find, because things just get added and added and added, or inserted. Because one of the great things about Hong Kong cinema is it's only 70 minutes long. Okay, we'll put in a fight here, or a chase in a modern day film, or something like that. I mean, there is this episodic quality, and it puts it probably pretty close to the musical in Western cinema. The idea that musical numbers can be more or less justified by the arc of the narrative, but they don't absolutely have to be. That, I think, is what we're dealing with here. And that could go back to this gentleman's question, that maybe it's harder for Hong Kong directors to adjust to that tighter narrative arc template than to the episodic one. But some Hong Kong filmmakers have tried to do that. I mean, if you look at Andrew Lau's Infernal Affairs, I mean, I remember when I saw that, I walked out and said, well, at last they made a Hollywood film, actually. And then, then Scorsese made it. And he actually did the mainland version, too, which is pretty amazing. But anyhow, yeah, I mean, there's a way in which that kind of narrative construction isn't so common. And the pause, burst, pause thing, you might want to generalize it a bit and say, actually, there is something to that, if writ large, you might be right. That is kind of one of the principles of Hong Kong dramaturgy, possibly. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could speak to how these patterns may have changed with the advent of digital technology, both from the perspective that the way films are constructed through editing has changed, and also with the introduction of CGI and how both Western filmmakers and Hong Kong filmmakers are actually exploring these type of editing strategies, but actually enhancing them further with impossible shots and impossible cuts, impossible cinematography.
Yeah. I have to say that my prime period really is mostly pre-digital for Hong Kong cinema. because I don't think I fully have a way to assess the impact of digital stuff. Certainly, they've copied a lot of American things with sort of very wild shots, or, for instance, a shot where some people are frozen in place and the protagonist, threads his way among them and those kinds of things, which is very easy to do now with digital. I don't have a sense that that's really made much of a change. I think that my guess would be the influence of Western cinema and Hong Kong cinema that's changed it most isn't technological, it's more aesthetic, and that the return of handheld shooting, which we've had for a long time, at least the 60s, but you can find it much earlier, the return of handheld shooting in Western cinema has actually led Hong Kong filmmakers of the 90s and aughts into a kind of fashion for handheld shooting, loose, improvisatory kind of framing and things like that. You see it a little bit in Andrew Lau's very cheap films, the Young and Dangerous films, things like that. But more and more, even in higher budgeted productions. And to me, they've taken away something. The rigor of the lockdown camera is really crucial to some of these effects in the classic kung fu films, but also in the modern action pictures, the urban action thrillers. And once you got handheld, then you're sacrificing some of that rigor, that pictorial sharpness. Yun Woping and Yun Kui really won't work as well as a handheld or even Steadicam-based aesthetic. So my sense is that in order to appear modern, in order to appear sort of up to speed with world film standards, they've lost some of that. And their effects, the punctuated, percussive kinds of effects I've been trying to point out, just aren't as salient anymore as they used to be. I take that partly because of the handheld shots. Sure, digital, fine. And you do have digital fight sequences now, of course. They can stay aloft for a long time, and Crouching Tiger really sort of starts with that, I think. But I hate to sound like an old guy all the time, but it's not the same anymore. Just me.
Hi there.
Yes.
Hi. Do you think that the fact that the martial arts has been practiced for thousands of years, the study of human motion, and also how to study the psychology, the way that humans react, especially in the Chinese dynasty, and trying to spread information and educate everybody. Do you think that came as an advantage to the martial arts cinema and why it's so appealing to people, especially in East Asia?
Yeah, I think that's partly right. I think what I have here is not exactly scientific in the Western sense, but you do have some systematic study of the way the body works with, say, medicine and anatomy, those kinds of things. And my sense would be that that kind of observation of what bodies can do and how energy flows through the body and so forth, that probably informed the thinking behind some of these practices. I would definitely say that. Taken beyond the pause, burst, pause rhythm, but just the general sense of what bodies can be, the study of the body in extremis, but also animal bodies as well, since so many kung fu forms are based on animal behavior. So a kind of scrutiny of movement, of animate movement, I think you're right. I think there's a point there that really these things maybe sensitized filmmakers more to the possibilities of this new medium of film in terms of rendering human movement. Yeah, I wouldn't find that out of place.
I was just curious, so we've sort of been talking about looking at a lot of films from the last, like up to the 90s. So I was just curious to know, and we talked about the various points of Hong Kong action cinema glossary. I was just curious what other things maybe in the last 20 years or so that's been added to the vocabulary.
Yeah, it really does tie to the other question. I think Hong Kong cinema has been dominated by old filmmakers for a very long time. They haven't really moved aside very much. There have been younger filmmakers, but they haven't achieved the recognition of their elders that their elders have had. So Choi Hak is still making films. Johnny To started making films in the 70s. These people have hung around a long time, and they're still the dominant forces. It's kind of like Lucas and Spielberg in Hollywood, They've been hanging around a long time. And so a lot of the innovation that might have come from younger filmmakers gaining some power hasn't happened very much. I mean, Colin can say more than I can about that. But I think my sense is that the old guys still rule. And so they're still, insofar as they're acting, they're still trying to, persist in pursuing these paths. That said, though, I think that some of the ways in which younger filmmakers are moving are very much in the tradition. Some newer films, I can't recall concretely at the moment. But newer films are, in a way, trying to refine some of these, usually with a fantastic or science fiction bent. Kung Fu Zero, is that one I'm thinking of, right? Yeah. Is that what it's called? Tai Chi Zero, sorry. Tai Chi Zero, yeah. That would be an example of also integration of special effects, very comic book-oriented special effects, that sort of thing. Those would be among the trends I guess I would point to, the superficial trends. But in terms of the kind of really deeper digging and exploration of what what's possible with this artistic framework, I haven't seen so much, actually, at least to my eye. I mean, I really kind of, just as all those other film movements had their day, we were talking about this earlier, that on an earlier panel, that maybe most of those film movements I sketched at the beginning lasted only 5 or 6 years. German Expressionism, Soviet Montage, New Wave, Neorealism. It's incredible that if this is right, this is partway right, this has lasted 30, 40 years. But maybe it's ended or ending. But my sense right now is that I don't see anything as artistically vigorous right now as the classics that we've come to look at. Colin, please.
So can we
By the way, this guy practically founded the study of Hong Kong cinema in Canada. And he doesn't look that old, and that's the most amazing thing. Well, he does look dissipated, but he doesn't look old.
I really like seeing how many people I recognize from Kung Fu Fridays who came out tonight. That means a lot. Well, I want to talk about actually that point when it all changed. Mm-hmm. And it's been talked about in Hong Kong critics and in the industry, Corey Yun Kwai, a number of the prime maestros of this cinema cite Jurassic Park as when it all changed.
Yeah.
That they went and saw Jurassic Park. They used to have something that they could deliver that no other cinema could match. And then suddenly Jurassic Park came in and digital animation changed everything. Mm-hmm. And I've heard so many stories about how they saw that and their hearts just fell, and they knew at that point they couldn't match, they couldn't continue to do their original stuff. Can you talk about Jurassic Park and
That's
that
really important.
period?
You're exactly right. I mean, Jurassic Park, I would say, is one of the most important films in recent film history. Partly, obviously, because the more Spielberg saw what Lucas could do, the more he gave over the film to that. I mean, he originally thought we'd use puppets and miniatures and all that stuff and very little digital effects. And the more that ILM showed him, the more he realized he didn't need those puppets and miniatures very much. But more importantly, that film was huge in Asia, as you know. It basically reopened the market. I mean, Spielberg's quite interesting because he actually conceived Jurassic Park as a global film. Other films had become sort of accidentally a worldwide sensation, but this one he plotted as a global film. He wanted to get into India, which was almost impossible for most Hollywood productions. He wanted to maximize the merchandising of the film to a degree that even E.T. had not achieved. So he really thought about this, and it opened up the market for big Hollywood films quite acutely. It came out in '93, but hit Asia mostly in '94. And it reopened the market for Hollywood films and really that film begins the takeover by Hollywood of the Hong Kong box office, I would say, followed by Speed and followed by other films. Speed, some people would argue, was a Hong Kong film at some level, but with a plot, with a very vigorous plot. And so, but somewhat episodic still, I guess. But anyway, the point is that that's the wedge I think you're quite right to point to. So it's very salient for those filmmakers as a box office extravaganza. But as you say, they see the special effects and they think, we're going to have problems. Wire work isn't going to cut it as much anymore. Please, go ahead.
And it was also when you got to see the spread of American films in Hong Kong, because up until that point, really, every year you looked at the top 10 films in Hong Kong, and it was always Hong Kong local product, which
dominated.
But then you can actually see the kind of the tentacles of American cinema and kind of trade coming in, where someone pointed out to me, actually Athena Choi pointed out to me that when the film Rob Roy came out, I played in one cinema. And then within a couple of months, Braveheart came out and it opened up in 10 cinemas. And there was this period where suddenly the American Hollywood got their hook in Hong Kong more somehow.
Absolutely. No, it's quite right. I mean, you look at those films that failed in Hong Kong, they could practically be a list of the top grossing films of the 80s and 90s. Back to the Future, all these films that grossed maximally elsewhere die in Hong Kong until the mid-90s, as you say.
Yeah, it was like Rob Roy was a flop, but suddenly the same kind of film opens up on more. And at that point, Mel Gibson wasn't quite the star.
Right.
So.
No, there is an economic dimension to all this. And one of the things we could talk about, it would be interesting maybe, is the way in which, to go back to the issue about dramaturgy and screenwriting, I mean, Hollywood invests so much money in development of a script. But this was not a problem for Hong Kong filmmakers. They could go to a financier and say, here are our stars, here's the setting, here's who's doing the choreography, give me some money. And especially Taiwanese business people would say, sure, yeah, here you go, and they would get it. And then they would figure out the action. It's very much like Bollywood, where you can sell your project on the strength of 2 or 3 musical numbers that you shoot completely independently. They're like the trailers for the film you're going to make. And people say, all right, if those have a minute, those stars, that stuff, fine. And you get the money, and then you figure out a script to stitch everything together. So that's tremendously important, because that means what's invested in terms of money and resources and talent, are the set piece action sequences. The weeks it took Jackie Chan to shoot that scene in the mall, or in the set that looks like a mall, that's where you put your money. The scene of Jackie talking on the phone, we can shoot, in a couple hours. So that kind of stuff, I mean, that's where they laid it on. And when they began to realize that you could spread the cost differently thanks to digital technology and something like Jurassic Park, that's got to change things. Also, at times, by the way, Jurassic Park comes along just as Hong Kong is already kind of losing momentum in its bigger markets like Taiwan, where people are saying the budgets are too big, we're not getting the money back. So there is a kind of there's an internal economic pressure in Hong Kong cinema that's intersecting with the external Hollywood pressure at that particular moment.
Hi.
Hi.
This is more of like an observation that after En Bach, there seemed to be an elevation of the return to Jackie Chan style action. And would you say that because of En Bach, it's kind of raised the bar for everybody else to kind of match it or go even further with CGI and all that other stuff? Would you say?
Now, as I remember, Ong Bak is pretty much done with practical effects. I don't think there's much CGI in that film, is there? I think it's really Tony Jaa as the new Jackie Chan, yeah. I guess I see Ong Bak as sort of a one-off. I mean, I didn't see it as starting a huge momentum towards that kind of cinema again. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Right. That is a development I should have mentioned, the idea of mixed martial arts and no longer the purity of Kung Fu, and the drama of the Kung Fu styles competing with each other, different schools competing, which is central to the 70s Kung Fu movies. That is no longer around, and now it's really much closer kind of street fighting in a certain way. That's true, yeah, that's true. But I don't see the Tony Jaa, I saw Tony Jaa really as kind of a one-off, and quickly appropriated by European cinema because, Luc Besson signed him up quick and decided he could make money with that, as he's done with, Jet Li and others. I mean, Luc Besson's quite an interesting filmmaker, producer, director, whatever he is, because he's trying to repackage Asian martial arts aesthetics for Western audiences in various ways at this time. Yeah, either with Tony Jaa or with the Jet Li pictures, like Danny the Dog, things like that. I mean, he's trying to keep that alive in a kind of adulterated form, a little dirtier form, actually, but still. Yeah, so they do have these outcroppings, it's true. You do have these little outbursts. But as a strong sort of central great tradition, I don't see it so much anymore. I mean, from what I can tell, contemporary Hong Kong cinema is really much more geared towards romantic comedies, the local appeals of romantic comedy, and maybe a little bit of, personal drama. But mostly romantic comedies, and the action pictures really have shifted into the costume dramas and historical spectacles that you get from the mainland, or with Hong Kong filmmakers, of course, contributing to that. But not the sort of purity of and fantasy too, of course, but not this sort of hard, pure stuff. One more question? Of course, if anyone has any personal problems they'd like to talk about, we'd certainly share it with the group. Yes?
The last comment you made about Hong Kong movie, geared to the romantic comedy, I don't quite agree, because I think my observation is that it always come with the star, like martial arts stars. Like in the '70s, early '70s, Bruce Lee, and then late '70s would be Jackie Chan, and early '80s with Jackie Chan, and then comes with Jet Li. Now would be Donnie Yen. Right, because he played Ip Man, which is the box office hit in Hong Kong.
That's correct.
Right. But who's next? It seems like it always.
Donnie Yen's Canadian, isn't he? No.
No.
I thought he was Canadian.
No, American-born.
His wife is Canadian. Okay.
Yeah.
But no, there was always one. But there's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because I think Donnie Yen has spent the last 20 years trying to be as big a star as the other people you've mentioned. And I think he's quite an accomplished actor as well as being a good martial artist, from my judgment. But I don't think that the same kind of, yes, the Ip Man films did very well. But again, I see them as one-off phenomena. I don't think it forms a tradition or a continuation of the tradition, except as a kind of, temporary one. I could be wrong. But he also appears in many of the mainland historical sagas too, Donnie Yen does. So, he's a very versatile figure. But now the way it seems to be split for Hong Kong filmmakers, at least the ones I've talked to, is local films, because mostly women are going to them, office ladies are going to them, tend to be either melodramas or comedies, romantic comedies. Films that are going to go beyond, either to the mainland or to Asia more widely, you have to join forces with the mainland in making these bigger projects, historical dramas, fantasy, spectacle, things like that. That's the take anyway I get. And Donnie Yen does play a role in those, that's for sure. That's it? Okay. Well, thanks again. The question was thank you very much.